What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. You know we normally dive deep into epic manhwa story recaps, but today we are kicking off a brand new series. We are expanding our horizons and bringing the gritty, frozen world of Skyrim fanfics to life, fully illustrated with some amazing AI-generated visuals. Before we jump into the art and the recap, I have to give you my quick review of today's story, The Quiet Shield. Honestly, this is a solid 10 out of 10 if you love dark, pragmatic storytelling. If you're excited about this new Skyrim series and want to see more, please smash that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Drop a like and let me know in the comments what fanfic you want to see me visualize next. Grab your mead, sit back, and let's get into The Quiet Shield.
The snow in Windhelm doesn't fall. It suffocates. It is a gray, heavy shroud that clings to the ancient stones of the Palace of the Kings, masking the scent of stale ale and old blood that permeates the city. I stood in the shadow of a crumbling archway in the Grey Quarter, watching a group of Stormcloaks stumble past. They were loud, boisterous, drunk on the hollow promise of Sons of Skyrim. To them, this city is a monument to Nordic pride. To me, it is a tomb. My parents died for that pride. They followed the bare banners into the marshes, believing in a cause that ultimately traded their lives for a few feet of frozen mud. Now, their legacy is reduced to a stained satchel hidden beneath a loose floorboard in a rented room that smells of damp wool and despair. I reached into the bag, my fingers brushing the vellum of their journals. The leather was stiff with dried swamp water and darker, more permanent stains. These weren't books of poetry or maps to hidden gold. They were catalogs of lethality. My father was a man who understood that the world doesn't care about your honor, only your survival. Scaly Pholiota, Imp Stool, Canis Root, the recipe for their paralyzing venom, a clinical solution for a messy world. I memorized the proportions, the way the fungi must be ground to retain the potency of the paralysis. Steel is honest, but it is slow. Poison is the pragmatist's edge. The noble Stormcloaks talk of freeing the land while they rot from the inside out, fueled by a cycle of meaningless bloodletting. They look at the dark elves in the slums and see enemies. I look at them and see a mirror. We are all just fuel for Ulfric's fire. I watched a young Nord recruit, barely old enough to shave, boasting about the true Nords taking back the Reach. He didn't see the way the seasoned veterans looked at him. They saw meat for the grinder. I saw a waste of good iron. Politics is a disease. It starts with a handshake and ends with a funeral pyre that no one remembers to light. I began to pack. I sold the last of my family's heirlooms, a silver ring, a moth-eaten cloak, to a fence who didn't ask questions. Every septum was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and this city. I didn't need memories. I needed gear. The iron armor I purchased was heavy, cold, and utterly devoid of ornament. It clanked with every step, a rhythmic reminder of the weight of existence. I strapped the iron shield to my back. It wasn't for heroic charges. It was a barrier against a coward's arrow or a blade in the dark while I was busy surviving. Windhelm is a city of ghosts. I refused to become one of them. The gates creaked open, the iron hinges screaming in the frost. I stepped out into the white nothingness of the tundra, the heavy iron battle axe a cold weight against my thigh. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me but rot. Ahead, the road to Whiterun stretched out like a jagged scar across the land. The tundra is a test of patience. Every mile is a battle against the wind that seeks the gaps in your armor and the silence that tries to hollow out your mind. I kept my head down, my eyes tracking the movement of the grass. In Skyrim, the things that don't make a sound are the ones that kill you. Whiterun appeared on the horizon like a jagged crown atop a hill. It was a city of trade and stone, a neutral ground in a land tearing itself apart. To the pilgrims, it was a holy site of Kinnereth. To me, it was a marketplace for the only thing I had left to sell, my labor. I entered through the main gates, the guards barely glancing at the dusty mercenary in common iron. I looked humble, and that was a weapon in itself. A man in Daedric plate invites a challenge. A man in dented iron is ignored. My first stop was the drunken huntsman. I needed information more than I needed a bed. The air inside was thick with the smell of roasting meat and cheap tallow. I sat in a corner, my back to the wall, and watched. A woman sat at a nearby table, her armor scarred and her eyes harder than the Nord steel she wore. Uthgerd, the Unbroken. She was a legend in the taverns, a warrior who had been cast out of the companions for a mistake she refused to name. "You look like you're looking for trouble, or work," she called out, her voice a low rasp. "In this city, they're usually the same thing." "I'm looking for a start," I replied, my voice dry from the road. "A start costs 100 gold," she said with a smirk, standing up, "and the strength to keep it. You want to prove you're more than just a pile of iron? Beat me in a brawl, and the gold is yours. Lose, and you walk away lighter." The tavern went quiet. This wasn't a fight for glory. It was a transaction. I unslung my shield and laid my battle axe on the table. My parents taught me that when you fight, you don't fight fair. You fight to finish. But in a tavern brawl, the rules are different. It's a test of endurance. She swung first, a heavy right hook that caught my shoulder. My iron pauldron absorbed the brunt of it, but the force rattled my teeth. I didn't dodge. I leaned into it. I drove a fist into her ribs, feeling the air leave her lungs. We traded blows like blacksmiths at an anvil. It was brutal, primal. There was no elegance here, only the dull thud of meat hitting meat. She was stronger, but I was more patient. I waited for the moment her aggression turned into desperation. When she lunged, overextending herself, I caught her arm and used her own momentum to drive her into the wooden pillar. My fist followed, stopping an inch from her nose. She gasped, blood trickling from her lip, then laughed. "Not bad, mercenary. You've got the stomach for it." She tossed a pouch of gold onto the table, 100 septims. "If you're looking for real coin and a place to sharpen that axe, go to Jorvaskr," she said, wiping her mouth. "The companions are always looking for new meat. Just don't expect them to treat you like a brother until you've bled for them." I picked up the gold. The companions. I'd heard the stories, the harbingers, the songs of Ysgramor, the pursuit of honor. Honor doesn't fill a stomach. It doesn't pay for the Canis Root and Imp Stool I needed for my kit. But the companions were an organization with deep pockets and a steady stream of contracts. Joining them wasn't a quest for brotherhood. It was a calculated career move. I left the huntsman and looked up toward the great mead hall that loomed over the city. The mercenary's price is always paid in blood. I just had to make sure it wasn't mine. The wind in Whiterun doesn't just howl. It whistles through the gaps in the stone like a dying man's last breath. I stood at the base of the steps leading to Jorvaskr, the oldest mead hall in Skyrim, looking up at the upturned hull of a ship that served as a roof. It was a monument to a past I didn't care for. Ancient heroes, 500 companions, and a glory that smelled remarkably like stale sweat and wet dog. To the common folk, the companions are legends. To me, they are a well-funded mercenary guild with better PR. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted goat and the sharp tang of Nord mead. In the center of the hall, 2 warriors were locked in a grapple, their grunts lost in the cheers of the onlookers. This was the Gilded Girdle, a trial by combat that served as the threshold for anyone seeking to earn their keep here. "Another one for the grinder!" a voice boomed. I turned to see Injata Stonearm. Her arms crossed over a chest plate that had seen more battles than I'd seen years. She didn't look impressed. She looked at my iron armor and saw a scavenger. She looked at my shield and saw a coward. "I'm here for work, not a sermon," I said, my voice cutting through the tavern din. "Work is earned," she spat, stepping into the circle. "You want to stand among the greats? Then stand against me. No weapons, just bone and grit. If you're still conscious when I'm done, maybe Kodlak will give you a glance." The rules were simple. No steel, no magic. Just the raw mechanics of survival. She moved with the fluid aggression of a saber cat. Her first strike was a jab aimed at my throat, lightning fast. I didn't parry. I took the blow on my forearm, the impact vibrating through my bones, and countered with a heavy shoulder barge. She stumbled back, eyes widening in surprise. I didn't give her room to breathe. I moved with clinical precision, my movements calculated to conserve energy while maximizing impact. Every time she swung, I was there, not to trade blows, but to redirect her momentum. "You fight like a shield maiden's shadow," she hissed, swinging a wild roundhouse. I ducked beneath it, my fist driving into her solar plexus. As she bent over, I didn't follow up with a theatrical finish. I simply stepped back and waited. She stayed down for a second, coughing, before rising slowly. The hall had gone quiet. The warriors at the long tables were no longer laughing. They were watching the man in the dented iron, who refused to play their game of honorable combat. "Enough!" a calm, weathered voice echoed from the balcony. Kodlak Whitemane looked down at me, his eyes clouded with age, but sharp with an intuition that made my skin crawl. He didn't see a hero. He saw a man who had already decided that the world was his enemy. "You have the strength," Kodlak said, his voice a low rumble. "But do you have the heart?" "I have an axe and a shield," I replied. "Heart is for poets. I prefer results." Kodlak sighed, a sound that carried the weight of centuries. "Vilkas, take him to the yard. Let's see what he does with a blade in his hand." I turned to leave, Injata's glare burning into my back. I hadn't made a friend. I'd made an impression. In this world, the former gets you killed, the latter gets you paid. The training yard of Jorvaskr was a patch of dirt and splinters, smelling of old blood and sharpening oil. Vilkas stood across from me, his Nord steel greatsword resting easily on his shoulder. He was the brain of the circle, a man who valued strategy almost as much as strength. "Kodlak says you're a pragmatist," Vilkas said, his eyes scanning the gaps in my iron plate. "Show me. Give me your best strikes. Don't worry about hurting me. I can take it." I didn't answer. I unslung the iron battle axe from my hip. Its weight was familiar, a comfort in a city that felt like a trap. I didn't aim for his sword. I aimed for his center of gravity. The bout was short. I swung the axe in a low arc, forcing him to parry downwards, then immediately brought my shield up to catch him under the chin. It wasn't warrior-like. It was efficient. Vilkas grunted, stepping back to reset. Vilkas spat blood into the dirt. "You know what your problem is?" Borz rested the axe against his shoulder. "Several people have offered opinions. You fight like every man around you is already dead." Silence settled between them. Then Borz answered, "That assumption has kept me alive." "Good. We don't need more heroes. We need more survivors." He sheathed his blade and handed me a bundle of iron swords. Take these to Yorland Greymane at the Skyforge. Tell him they need a sharper edge than the milk drinkers in the city can provide. I took the swords. This was the mercenary's start, the grunt work. The Skyforge loomed over Whiterun, a massive stone eagle carved into the very peak of the hill. The heat radiating from it was intense, a physical wall that blurred the air. Yorland was there, his hammer striking a rhythm that seemed to beat in time with the heart of the mountain. "Vilkas sent me," I said, dropping the swords near the anvil. Yorland didn't look up. "He did he? And what are you? Another pup looking for a legend to hide behind?" "Companions are going to use these," I said, my gaze level with his. "The sharper they are, the less time I spend in the dirt." Yorland paused, his hammer hovering. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw the pragmatism etched into my face. "Fine. If you want to be useful, stay here. Watch the fire. A man who understands the forge understands the world." While he worked, I watched the way the steel changed color, the way the heat forced the impurities to the surface. It was a clinical process, alchemy in a different form. "You're not like the others," Yorland remarked, his voice softened by the roar of the forge. "They come here for the song of the steel. You come for the edge." "Songs don't kill bandits," I muttered. That evening, Ayla the huntress found me at the training dummies. She moved with a silence that was unnatural, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the city's braziers. "Vilkas says you're ready for a real contract," she said, her voice a dangerous purr. "There's a group of Silver Hand hiding out in a cave near the border. They've been harassing our shipments. Kill the leader, and the gold is yours." Silver Hand. The name carried a weight of bitterness in the hall. To the companions, they were enemies of honor. To me, they were just another obstacle between me and my next meal. "I don't care who they are," I said, strapping my shield back into place. "I only care if their gold is as good as yours." "It's not about the gold, whelp," Ayla said, a toothy grin crossing her face. "It's about the blood." I walked toward the gates of Whiterun, the cold air hitting my face. The quiet shield was moving out. I didn't seek the blood, but I knew the price of entry into this life. Blood and higher. It was a fair trade in a land that offered nothing for free. The air in the underforge smelled of wet fur and ancient copper, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. I stood in the shadows, my back against the cold stone, watching the circle debate the sanctity of their blood. To them, the beast was a gift from Hircine. To me, it was just another master. Another set of chains forged in the fires of Daedric politics. "The Silver Hand is moving against us, Borz," Skior said, his voice a low growl that echoed off the damp walls. I didn't care for their blood feud. The Silver Hand were fanatics, and the companions were monsters in denial. But the Silver Hand had resources, refined steel, and silver that could be repurposed. If the quest for vengeance provided the materials for my survival, I would play the part of the loyal shield brother. My current gear, the clanking cold iron armor, was beginning to fail me. Every joint screamed with the friction of travel, a constant reminder that iron is the metal of a desperate man, not a prepared one. I needed something better, something neutral. I had begun the transition. I wore a hybrid of steel Nordic plates over my vitals, the weight distributed more evenly than the crude iron set. It was a bridge between the mercenary I was and the fortress I intended to become. "We hit Gallows Rock," Ayla stated, her eyes shimmering with a predatory light. "I'll be ready," I replied, my voice as flat as the Whiterun plains. Ayla studied him for a long moment. You know what bothers me about you, Borz? He adjusted the strap on his shield. That depends on how long the list is. A faint smirk touched her lips before disappearing. You kill like it's farm work. It is work. No, Ayla said quietly. Work ends when you go home. The firelight danced across her face, sharpening the frustration in her eyes. But you never stop fighting, even when nobody's attacking you. Ayla stared into the fire for a while before speaking again. You know what the worst part is? She muttered. Borz remained silent. Kodlak wants peace. Vilkas wants tradition. Skjor wanted war. She shook her head. And the companions are rotting somewhere between all three. That caught Borz's attention. For the first time, she didn't sound like a hunter. She sounded tired. Borz didn't answer, because for once, he wasn't sure she was wrong. The march to Gallows Rock was a lesson in the pointlessness of war. The Silver Hand fought for purity, yet they died just as easily as any bandit when an iron bolt found the gap in their gorget. I moved through the snow with a grim detachment. Inside Gallows Rock, the Silver Hand died the same way every fanatic eventually did, confused that conviction didn't stop bleeding. Inside the fort, the fighting was visceral. The Silver Hand utilized silver blades that hummed with a specific hate for the beast. I met them with my iron shield, the heavy wood and metal absorbing strikes intended for my spine. Every time a Silver Hand soldier fell, I didn't see a defeated enemy. I saw a pile of usable leather straps and steel reinforcements. 3 ounces of steel, a strip of cured leather, a pouch of septums. By the time the last fanatic lay gasping in the dust of the ruin, the honor of the companions had been upheld. I stood over a cooling corpse, wiping the grime from my new Nordic hybrid bracers. The Silver Hand was an escalation, a sign that the world was getting more dangerous. Steel kills, but the world was starting to require something sharper than just steel. It required a way to stop a heart before the blade even swung. The laboratory at Golden Hills Plantation was the only place where I felt a semblance of control. While the wheat swayed in the Rorikstead breeze outside, the air inside was thick with the pungent, earthy scent of fungi and roots. On the table lay my parents' journals, the pages yellowed and stiff with the dried blood of a life they couldn't defend. The recipe was simple: Scaly Pholiota, Imp Stool, and Canis Root. To a layman, it was a paralyzing agent. To me, it was the ultimate equalizer. I began the refinement process with the same clinical precision I used in a brawl. The Canis Root provided the rigid structure, the Imp Stool the neurological shock, and the Scaly Pholiota acted as the delivery catalyst. I ground them down, watching the colors bleed into a murky, toxic green. My parents had used this to survive the swamps. I would use it to dominate the tundra. I took a handful of iron bolts and dipped the heads into the viscous fluid. They didn't need to be pretty. They didn't need to be legendary. They just needed to be a delivery system for the end of a heartbeat. I tested the new batch on a group of raiding bandits near the edge of the tundra. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. The leader, a massive orc in a mismatched plate, charged with a roar that should have curdled my blood. I leveled the iron crossbow. The mechanism clicked, a sound more satisfying than any bard's song. The bolt struck him in the shoulder, a shallow wound that wouldn't have stopped a wolf. Then, the venom took hold. His muscles locked mid-stride. The roar died in his throat, replaced by a wet rattle as his diaphragm seized. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his eyes wide and staring, reflecting the gray Skyrim sky. He was alive, but he was no longer a threat. He was just another resource waiting to be claimed. I walked over and retrieved the bolt, wiping it clean. The efficiency was terrifying. No wasted energy. No warrior's spirit. Just chemistry and physics. One bolt could now still the heart of a giant. I looked at the small vial of green liquid in my hand. This was the edge I had been seeking. This was the insurance policy against a world that tried to crush the quiet ones. As I made my way back to the farm, I thought of Sylgia in Red Belly Mine. She worked the earth with a pickaxe, a simple honesty that the jarls in their stone palaces could never understand. I was a scavenger, a mercenary, and now an alchemist of death. But here, on the road to Rorikstead, I was simply Borz. And with this new venom, I would ensure that Borz lived long enough to see the harvest. The politics of the companions and the honor of the Nords were noise. The only truth was the weight of the crossbow in my hand and the silence of a paralyzed enemy. The fragments of Wuthrad felt heavier than they looked, their jagged edges singing a low, discordant hum that resonated in the marrow of my bones. Yorland Greymane had looked at them with a reverence bordering on religious mania, his weathered hands trembling as he touched the ancient metal. To him, it was the soul of the companions, the key to returning to the glory of the 500. To me, it was raw material, a legacy of blood and conquest that I needed to forge into something that didn't just bite, but endured. I stood before the Skyforge, the heat of the ancient furnace searing the air in my lungs. My wolf armor lay discarded on a nearby bench, its ornate designs and cultural baggage feeling like a second skin I was eager to shed. It was too loud, too evocative of the beast blood that the circle treated like a holy gift. I needed something silent. I needed a fortress I could wear. "The steel needs to breathe, Borz," Yorland grunted, his hammer rhythmically striking a hot ingot of Nord steel. "You can't just bury the ancient fragments under layers of common iron." "I'm not burying it," I replied, my voice flat against the roar of the forge. "I'm reinforcing it. Legend is a fragile thing, Yorland. It cracks under a mace just as easily as bone. I want the strength of Ysgramor, but the utility of a survivor." I watched as the transition began. The Nordic steel was a beautiful, stubborn metal, its surface catching the orange light of the forge in a way that iron never could. We integrated the fragments into the core plates, a hidden foundation of ancient power beneath a practical, heavy design. The new suit, the legacy of Ysgramor, was becoming a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering. It was dense, the plates overlapping with a precision that left no gaps for a stray blade. As the cooling oil hissed against the finished breastplate, I felt a strange sense of alignment. The armor settled across his shoulders with the weight of permanence. I was a man who had seen his parents rot in a swamp because they weren't strong enough to hold what was theirs. This armor wouldn't make me a legend, but it would make me a ghost, a man the world would struggle to break twice. I strapped the gauntlets on, feeling the weight settle over my forearms. The balance was perfect. The cynical part of my mind whispered that I was just wondering if survival always required carrying something heavy. But as I looked at the shimmering, cold surface of the Nord steel, I knew better. This wasn't a uniform for the companions. This was the shell of a man who intended to outlast everyone who called him brother. The air near Darkwater Crossing was thick with the scent of sulfur and old, unwashed leather. I moved through the steam of the hot springs, my new legacy armor silent despite its immense weight. The Nord steel hummed with a quiet confidence. I wasn't here for a contract, and I wasn't here for the honor of the hunt. I was here for a test. A giant stood near a scorched campfire, its massive silhouette framed against the jagged peaks of the Pholiota Mountains. It was a primordial force, a creature that could crush a horse with a single swing of its stone club. To the Nords, they were respected neighbors or terrifying monsters. To me, the giant was a variable in a very specific equation. I knelt in the tall grass, the damp earth soaking into the leather underpinnings of my greaves. I pulled the iron crossbow from my back, the mechanism feeling familiar and cold in my hands. I reached into my belt pouch and pulled out a single bolt, its tip glistening with the murky green venom I had perfected back at Golden Hills. Scaly Pholiota, Imp Stool, Canis Root. The alchemist's edge was no longer just a theory. I sighted down the length of the bolt. The giant turned, its prehistoric eyes scanning the mist, perhaps sensing the shift in the wind. It didn't matter. I wasn't a warrior looking for a fair fight. I was a predator with a clinical objective. Click! The bolt flew true, a dark streak against the gray sky. It struck the giant in the thick muscle of its thigh, a pinprick compared to the creature's massive bulk. The giant roared, a sound that vibrated the very stones beneath me, and raised its club to find the source of the irritation. It took 3 seconds. The roar died into a confused gurgle. The massive club slipped from the creature's fingers, thudding into the soft earth with a sound like a falling tree. The giant's legs buckled, its nervous system surrendering to the chemical cocktail coursing through its veins. It didn't die, not yet, but it was still. It lay there, a mountain of flesh and bone, rendered completely immobile by a few drops of refined sap and fungus. I stepped closer, the snow crunching under my ebony-plated boots. I didn't feel a warrior's triumph. There was no song to be sung here. I extracted what alchemical components I needed, leaving the beast breathing but paralyzed in the dirt. It would recover, eventually, or the wolves would find it. It wasn't my concern. My hypothesis was proven. Borz turned away from the paralyzed giant, but the sound stopped him. A low wheezing, not rage, not pain, fear. The giant's massive eye followed him through the steam, confused and helpless. For a moment, Borz saw something he hated. Not a monster, a creature that had trusted its own strength the same way he trusted his armor. And both had failed. His grip tightened around the crossbow. The feeling passed quickly. It had to, because hesitation was the luxury that buried people beneath Skyrim's snow. Still, the road back to Darkwater Crossing felt quieter than before. Yet, as I stood alone in the freezing geysers of Darkwater Crossing, the silence was deafening. I had spent my life building walls, of iron, of Nord steel, of ebony, and of venom. I was completely secure and completely isolated. Borz stood alone beside the steaming springs for a long moment. The giant still breathed behind him, somewhere in the fog. He adjusted the strap of his crossbow, then stopped halfway through the motion. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel safe. I turned my boots away from the wilderness and began the trek toward Shore's Stone. The mining settlement was a collection of wooden huts and soot-stained faces nestled in the shadows of the rift. It was a place defined by honest, back-breaking labor. The miners didn't fight for glory or dead kings. They fought the rock for a day's wage. Walking into the camp, the heavy imposing plates of the legacy of Ysgramor felt strangely out of place. This wasn't a battlefield or a den of monsters. It was a place where people lived, not just survived. I found Sylgia sitting outside her home, her eyes bright despite the dust of the mines. There was a softness in her presence that acted as an abrasive against my hardened exterior. In her world, problems were solved with a pickaxe and a steady hand, not a poisoned bolt and a heavy axe. "You look like you're carrying the weight of all Skyrim on those shoulders, Borz," she said, her voice a warm melody that cut through the hiss of the nearby steam vents. "It's just the Nord steel, Sylgia," I replied, the lie feeling heavy on my tongue. "It's designed to endure." Sylgia looked at the scars across his knuckles. "You know what bothers me?" she asked quietly. Borz frowned. "You talk about surviving like it's different from living." She folded the mended cloth in her lap. "But every time you come back here, you look disappointed that you survived again," she countered, stepping closer. The contrast was staggering. My hands, stained with the residue of Scaly Pholiota and giant's blood, felt clumsy and destructive near her. To secure her family's blessing, I had to step away from the man whose survival had shaped him into and pretend, if only for a moment, that I was a man who belonged by a hearth instead of a forge. I delivered her father's satchel, a simple errand that carried more weight than any companion's contract. Her parents looked at me not as a harbinger or a legendary warrior, but as a man who might take their daughter away from the safety of the earth. Their blessing wasn't won with a show of strength, but with a quiet promise of stability. It was a transaction of the soul. I gave them the assurance that my steel would be a wall around her, and in return, I felt the first flickering warmth of a life that didn't require me to be a monster. Later that evening, Sylgia sat beside him near the riverbank, tossing small stones into the current. "You know," she said, "people in Shore's Stone keep asking if you're some kind of war hero." Borz snorted quietly. "They should lower their standards." "I'm serious." "I know." She looked at him carefully. "And every time someone praises you, you look irritated. Praise usually comes right before someone asks for something." Sylgia laughed softly at that, but the sound faded quickly. "You don't trust kindness much, do you?" Sylgia looked away toward the river. "You know," she said quietly, "half the town thinks you're dangerous." Borz gave a dry shrug. "They're observant." "I'm serious." "So am I." She turned toward him then, frustration flickering across her face for the first time. "That's the problem, Borz." The words caught him slightly off guard. "You talk about yourself like you're some storm that people survive instead of a man they can care about." Silence settled between them. The river carried on beside the rocks. "I don't need a legend," Sylgia continued softly. "I just want to know when you stop expecting everyone to leave." Borz looked down at his scarred hands. For once, he had no answer ready. Borz opened his mouth to answer, then stopped, because he realized he genuinely didn't know. As I stood by the Darkwater River that evening, the orange glow of the sunset reflecting off my armor, I realized the irony. I had forged the legacy of Ysgramor to be an unstoppable force, a walking fortress. But looking at the simple ring Sylgia had given me, the miner's blessing, I knew the heaviest thing I would ever have to carry wasn't the steel. It was the hope of a peaceful end. For a man like me, peace was the most dangerous prospect of all. Borz accepted a simple contract near Rorikstead. Bandits occupying a collapsed watchtower. Routine work. He arrived at dusk. The first bolt dropped the sentry before the man even understood he was dying. The second struck a woman carrying an axe down the tower stairs. Efficient. Clean. Borz entered the ruin expecting the usual aftermath. Blood, coin, silence. Instead, he found a child hiding beneath a broken table. The boy couldn't have been older than 8. Wide eyes, filthy hands, starving. Borz stopped. The child looked at the dead woman near the staircase. "Ma?" The word hit harder than any warhammer. Borz said nothing. The boy crawled toward the corpse with desperate confusion, shaking her shoulder with tiny trembling hands. "She said we were leaving tomorrow," the child whispered. Borz felt the weight of the crossbow in his grip. Suddenly it felt ugly. Not powerful, not efficient, just ugly. He left every coin in his pouch beside the child and walked out without taking the contract reward. The road back to Whiterun felt colder than usual. Cold air drifted through the Ysgramor's tomb in slow currents, carrying the smell of old stone and extinguished fire. It was a cold that bit deeper than the Windhelm frost, a cold that had sat undisturbed for eras. Borz stepped forward, the obsidian-flecked plates of his armor grinding with a low, rhythmic growl. He wasn't alone. The ghosts of the companions past, the honored dead who had never found rest, shimmered into existence. They were pale, flickering echoes of warriors, their swords raised in a silent, eternal challenge. Borz didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a prayer or a challenge. He simply moved. He was an unstoppable force of nature. A ghost lunged, its spectral blade whistling toward his neck. Borz didn't dodge. He leaned into the strike, letting the ebony-reinforced pauldron catch the blow. The spectral steel shattered against the walking fortress, dissipating into harmless mist. With a grunt of focused effort, Borz swung his battle axe in a wide, punishing arc. The weighted head of the axe tore through the spirit's essence, shredding the vapor until nothing remained but the lingering scent of ozone. This is the glory they sing about, Borz thought, his mind detached and cynical even amidst the fray. Dying in a hole so your ghost can guard a pile of rocks, a waste of good steel. He reached the inner chamber where the blue palace of the mind met the reality of the crypt. The ghosts were thicker here, the air heavy with the weight of the 500 companions. The deeper Borz walked into the tomb, the heavier the silence became. Not ordinary silence, expectant silence. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, worn smooth by centuries of frost and sea air. Warriors with shattered shields, longships burning beneath black skies, kings raising swords toward distant shores that no longer existed. The companions called this place sacred. Borz thought it felt tired. Even the ghosts attacked without fury now. They came forward like echoes, repeating motions they had forgotten the meaning of. One spirit swung an axe through Borz's shoulder guard. The impact rang through the ebony plates like a funeral bell. The ghost stared at him for a brief moment afterward, not angry, almost confused, as though it no longer remembered why it was still fighting. Borz understood that feeling more than he wanted to. Borz raised his iron crossbow. He had loaded it with the peak refinement bolts, the ones coated in the paralyzing venom of his ancestors. He fired. The bolt didn't just strike. It anchored. The alchemical reaction, though designed for the living, seemed to have a grounding effect on the ethereal. The spirits slowed, their movements becoming sluggish and brittle. Borz walked through them, his iron shield deflecting arrows from the shadows with a series of dull, reassuring thuds. In the heart of the tomb, the flame of the Harbinger burned low. Codlac Whitemane's spirit stood there, besieged not by ghosts, but by the shadow of the wolf. Borz looked at the old man. He felt a rare flicker of something approaching respect. Codlac had been a man of politics, yes, but he had also been a man who recognized the chains he wore. He had wanted out. "The fire, Borz," the spirit of Codlac whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "Cast the heart in. End the hunt." Borz stepped toward the flame of the Harbinger. He held the Glenmoral witch's head, a grisly, dripping trophy of a hunt he hadn't enjoyed. He looked at the severed thing, then at the fire. One last act of service, Borz thought. Not for the glory of the companions, not for the songs, but because a man should be allowed to die as himself, not as a beast. He tossed the head into the flames. The roar that followed was not of fire, but of a soul being torn asunder. The spirit of the wolf manifested, a snarling, shadowy beast that lunged at Borz with primal fury. Borz met it head-on. He dropped his crossbow and gripped his battle-axe with both hands. The wolf struck his chest, its claws scraping against the ebony flecks. Borz didn't move. He felt the beast's hot, foul breath against his visor. With a roar of his own, a human roar devoid of Hircine's taint, he drove the axe head deep into the shadow's throat. The beast dissolved into white light, and for a moment the tomb was silent. For several seconds, Borz didn't move. The axe remained buried in the stone floor beneath him. The tomb had finally gone silent. Not peaceful, empty. The kind of emptiness left behind after something had spent too long refusing to die. Borz slowly pulled the axe free. The sound echoed through Ysgramor's crypt, like the closing of a grave. Kodlak stood tall, his spirit no longer flickering, no longer shadowed. You have done it, Borz. You are the harbinger now. The shield of Ysgramor is yours to lead. Borz looked down at the shield of Ysgramor, resting on the pedestal. It was a masterpiece of ancient craft, a symbol of ultimate authority. To the men back at Jorrvaskr, it was the greatest prize in Skyrim. To Borz, it looked like a very heavy, very shiny chain. He felt the weight of his own armor, the obsidian peak he had built to protect his peace. He thought of Golden Hills. He thought of the sway of the wheat and the quiet honesty of Sylgia's smile. Harbinger, Borz repeated, the word tasting like ash. Another reason for men to ask me to die for their dreams. He reached out and took the shield, but he didn't strap it to his arm. He turned back toward the entrance, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The walking fortress began its long trek back to the light, leaving the ghosts and the glory behind in the dark.
The tomb felt smaller on the return journey. Not physically, just emptier, and the metallic tang of faded magic. My boots, heavy with the weight of ebony-reinforced steel, didn't echo, they thudded, a rhythmic declaration of presence in a place meant for the silent dead. Behind me, the circle stood in a daze of reverence and exhaustion. Kodlak was gone, freed from the lupin rot that threatened his soul, and I was the one holding the flame. They called me Harbinger. I looked at the shield of Ysgramor in my hands. It was a magnificent thing, etched with the history of a people who defined themselves by the blood they spilled and the enemies they outlasted. To Vilkas, it was a holy relic. To Ayla, it was a symbol of the hunt. To me, it was 5 pounds of enchanted wood and metal that I didn't need. You are the first among us now, Borz, Vilkas said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite fathom, or perhaps I simply chose not to. The shield belongs to the Harbinger. I looked at him, truly looked at him. He was a man who lived for the we, for the honor of a hall that had stood since the Merithic era. He wanted the weight. He craved the structure of the lineage. Vilkas held the shield carefully, almost reverently. Borz noticed the difference immediately. To Vilkas, the shield was the purpose. Vilkas ran a thumb across the shield's worn edge. When Kodlak died, he said quietly, "Everyone looked at me first." Borz frowned slightly.
Vilkas gave a humorless laugh, and I hated that I was relieved when they chose you instead. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, just honest. To Borz, it was weight. That was the problem. "No," I said. The word was short, punchy, leaving no room for the flowery protests of Nordic tradition. I stepped forward and pressed the shield into Vilkas's chest. He stumbled back a step, instinctively catching the rim. "Borz?" Ayla's voice was sharp, a hunter sensing a sudden shift in the wind. "I didn't come here for a title," I said, my internal monologue a cynical hum beneath the surface of my calm exterior. "I came to finish a job for a man I respected. The job is done. Kodlak is at peace. I'm going home." "You're walking away?" Vilkas asked, staring at the shield as if it were a dragon's egg about to hatch. "I'm walking towards something else," I replied. I turned my back on them. The legacy of Yazgrimor armor clanked softly that I had built piece by piece, with my own gold and my own labor. It wasn't a gift from a god or a reward from a king. It was mine. As I walked toward the exit of the tomb, the blue light of the soul fire dimmed behind me. I didn't look back. I had spent my life escaping the gray ashes of Windhelm and the blood-soaked illusions of the Stormcloaks. I wasn't about to let the honor of Whiterun become my new cage. The sun was low on the horizon when I stepped out into the Skyrim air. It was cold, biting, and honest. I checked the seals on my alchemy pouches. I felt the weight of my battle axe against my hip, a tool for survival, not a scepter. The Skyrim air felt painfully cold in his lungs. And for the first time in years, that felt honest.
The transition from the tundra to the Rorikstead plains is always a shift in color. The harsh grays and whites of the high peaks give way to a stubborn, windswept gold. This was my sanctuary. Golden Hills Plantation didn't care about the Civil War. It didn't care about the return of the dragons or the lineage of the companions. It cared about the pH of the soil and the timing of the frost. I walked through the gate, the armor feeling heavier than usual, not because I was tired, but because it was becoming unnecessary. Janasa was near the windmills, her dark eyes tracking my approach with the clinical detachment of a fellow pragmatist. She nodded once. She didn't ask about the tomb or the title. She knew I'd come back. "The Scaly Pholiota is ready for harvest," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "And the wheat is heavy. We'll need the extra hands tomorrow." "I'll be there," I said. I climbed the porch steps of the farmhouse. The wood groaned under the weight of my boots. Inside, the air smelled of dried lavender, seared leeks, and the sharp medicinal tang of the lab in the basement. Sylgia was there, sitting by the fire. She didn't rise with a cry of, "My hero." She simply looked up from her mending, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the hearth. "You're back late," she said softly. "The road was long," I replied. I began the ritual of shedding the steel. The gauntlets came off first, then the pauldrons, then the heavy obsidian-flecked cuirass. I didn't place them on a pedestal. I put them in the chest by the door. Finally, I took my battle axe, the weighted iron tool that had split the skulls of bandits and ghosts alike, and hung it over the fireplace. It wasn't a trophy. It was a shovel that had finished digging the grave of my past. Borz stared at the axe for a long moment. For years, every decision in his life had been made by fear. Fear of weakness, fear of helplessness, fear of ending up forgotten beneath the mud like his parents. Now the weapon simply hung there above the fire, silent and ordinary. He wasn't sure when that change had happened. And somehow, that frightened him more than any battlefield ever had. I sat down in the chair opposite Sylgia. My internal monologue, usually a frantic ledger of threats and tactical advantages, finally fell silent. I looked out the window at the swaying wheat. I thought about the journals I'd found in the Grey Quarter, stained with the swamp water that had claimed my parents. They had died for a cause that didn't know their names. They had traded their lives for a noble idea that left their son a scavenger in the snow. For years, Borz had told himself he survived because he was smarter than they were, stronger, more practical. But sitting there beside the fire, he finally understood something that made his chest feel strangely hollow. His parents had probably believed they were protecting him too. I had made a different trade. I had used the steel to buy the soil. I had used the venom to protect the peace. "The farm looks good, Borz," Sylgia murmured, her hand finding mine. "It's quiet," I said. Beyond the borders of Golden Hills,
Skyrim was still a cacophony of shouting kings and dying men, but here, in the golden light of the harvest, the only sound was the wind in the grain and the crackle of the fire. Sylgia's hand remained in his. Outside, the wheat bent softly beneath the evening wind. For once, Borz didn't feel the need to prepare for tomorrow, and that frightened him less than it used to.